Chris Evans, good morning and thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
On Tuesday, when the Prime Minister gave her speech at the Lowy Institute, on that day, what was the government's preferred location for that centre?
Well, the Prime Minister laid out the fact that we were looking for a regional solution, that it had to engage the whole region in finding a framework that provided protection, and that we needed a centre in a country that would host it. And then she went on to describe who she'd spoken to in starting to pursue that arrangement. So she was fairly clear about who she'd spoken to. But it was clear from a radio interview I did, I think, on Wednesday morning on Radio National, that of course there were alternatives and that we were talking to East Timor, but alternatives were possible.
So just to repeat that question, because I don't think you've quite answered that this morning, at that moment and on that day, what was the preferred place of the government?
Well, what the Prime Minister did is she indicated who she'd spoken to, but she also made it clear it's a decision for their national government. You can't go around speaking on behalf of other national governments, but clearly she made it clear who she'd spoken to. But as I say, there seems to be some surprise that alternatives were possible, and as I say, both Stephen Smith and I have numerous interviews made it clear that there are alternatives, but that discussions had started with East Timor.
It does really beg up understanding when Julie Gillard says something like this: "Today I announce we will begin a new initiative. In recent days I've discussed with President Ramos Horta of East Timor the possibility of establishing a regional processing centre for the purpose of receiving and processing of the irregular entrants to the region." Then goes on and answers 4 specific questions on East Timor, and now tells us that I'm not going to leave unquestioned the impression that we're talking about a specific location. That, to me and to any other ordinary person on the bus, would mean that you're talking to East Timor about a processing centre there. Why are you now trying to argue that black is white?
Well, I don't think we are. I mean, the Prime Minister indicated in that speech that she'd spoken to the President of East Timor, Ramos Horta, and that she'd spoken to the New Zealand Prime Minister, Mr Key, and that she was seeking to speak to the President of Indonesia. So she's been quite clear who she was speaking to. I think what she stressed was, though, it needed to be a regional solution, not just one for Australia, not a quick fix, but a regional solution, and that she was engaging in conversations throughout the region. And clearly those conversations would determine the details, if you like, and that we shouldn't be jumping too far ahead of ourselves. Now, I know the media want to know exactly where, how many people, how they're going to be processed. All those things have to be part of a conversation with other regional countries, and it would be rude and counterproductive for us to get too far ahead.
But it seems like that's exactly what you've done, because the Prime Minister was very clear about having spoken to East Timor and about establishing a centre there, but it would seem that you've gotten a bit ahead of yourself in the announcement, because the conversations that needed to be had with the government there have not taken place. And in fact, we're still hearing that. We're hearing from Jose Ramos Horta that he's still not. He said as recently as last night, he's still not received a letter from the government. He hasn't received any details from the government about this centre. So why did you get so ahead of yourselves on that?
Well, that's not a fair interpretation at all. What East Timor says is they're open to the dialogue, they're open to the discussion.
Yes, they're open to the discussion, but they've not yet received anything from the government on this.
Well, the Prime Minister rang the leaders of the various countries end of last week, early this week. She gave her speech, I think, on the Tuesday. Stephen Smith and I discussed yesterday how we're going to proceed in terms of putting more detailed propositions to people. And there's been work going on among officials to pursue the idea. So, as is also the case, of course, there's been some work done in the past about how we might provide this regional protection framework. So it is only a matter of a couple of days since the announcement was made, and we will be pursuing it vigorously with countries in the region over coming weeks.
All right, so just before we move off this, then, just to get this absolutely clear, you're saying this morning this is a media supposition, that the media has just supposed that the centre was to be in East Timor, that the Prime Minister never meant to give the impression that on that day one of the great possibilities, if not the preference, was East Timor. This has all been a misconstruction by the media, has it?
Well, Virginia, I'm not as focused on what the media thought or didn't think.
No, I'm just trying to focus here on just what the government would prefer to do, what the preferred place was.
What you need to do is look at what the Prime Minister said in her speech. You've got a copy of that.
Yes, and I've read that out, and I think it's pretty clear.
I will read the transcript of what I said on Radio National the next morning, where I made it clear that there are alternatives if in pursuing this, that we needed to look at alternatives. So it's been on the public record for days. I'm not sure what the excitement's about, but the Prime Minister has been very clear that we're pursuing a regional solution. We're talking to our partners in the region, and we'll be pursuing that over coming weeks.
So were you on a slightly different track then from the next day to your Prime Minister, where she was very direct and clear about it being East Timor, but you were always talking about other countries?
No, look, we were talking about who she'd spoken to, which she made clear. We're talking about how a regional protection framework and a processing centre might work. And when asked about that question, I just made it clear that, of course, there are alternatives. But we were having a conversation with East Timor. They have responded that they're prepared to engage in that conversation, and we'll be following that up. And as I say, I spoke with the Foreign Minister, Stephen Smith, last night about the work being done by officials, and we'll be pursuing that over coming days and weeks. All
right. Well, where next? So, first of all, is the issue, the possibility with East Timor, is that over now? Are you turning your attention to other places, or is that still a possibility?
Well, Virginia, you just told me what you understand the Prime Minister of East Timor to have said, which is they're open to discussion.
No, I'm just trying to find out now, from your point of view, whether you believe it's possible to persuade East Timor, because that country seems very divided over it now. So what's your understanding of whether you can bring them across?
Well, I don't think it's fair to describe them as divided. They've said they're prepared to engage in the conversation, and will do that. They are a vibrant democracy. They have different views inside their community, as we do. And I think for someone to be suddenly surprised that there might be a divergence of views is I think it's a bit condescending. We've spoken to them, we've spoken to the leadership, and we're going to have a further conversation, which they said they're open to.
The opposition leader today has actually said that you should put in a phone call to Nauru. Is that a possibility? Is that a place you would consider now?
Well, Nauru aren't signatories to the Refugees Convention, and the Prime Minister's made it very clear that we're talking to people who are signatories to the Refugees Convention. One of the problems with the Pacific solution and the use of Nauru was it put it outside that international law. It made bodies like the UNHCR and other international bodies very critical of it for that reason, among others, and so it's not the way that we're proceeding.
So Manus Island is a bit more of a possibility then?
No, I told you we're engaged in discussions with East Timorese government. We'll be pursuing those over coming days, and we'll see how that goes as part of a broader conversation with other countries in the region. OK,
but I just need to clarify that. So are you saying Manus Island is not a possibility?
What I've said to you is that we are pursuing discussions with East Timor, and that we'll also be talking to other countries in the region about how we make a regional protection framework and processing centre work. The Prime Minister has indicated to you who she's spoken to, and she indicated to you how that process would be pursued now. And I'm not going to go run through the lists of who else may or may not. I know people want all the detail on day one. The Prime Minister said there's no...
Well, it's actually several days after day one, and it's not unreasonable to ask for the detail, Minister.
Well, I think, Virginia, to suggest that an international diplomatic initiative that involved a range of countries is going to be resolved in 2 days is quite frankly unreasonable.
I'm simply asking if Manus is on the list. You can simply answer that yes or no.
Well, no, what I'm saying to you is we'll be discussing with all the countries in the region how we progress this. That'll be done in private, but the Prime Minister did indicate who she'd spoken to, and we're going to go about it in a methodical way and talk to all our regional partners about how we can get what we think is a significant contribution to stopping the evil trade of people smuggling up and running in the region, so that everyone who seeks asylum in the region has a fair chance of having their claims heard and assessed properly without having to take dangerous journeys or without feeling that they won't get their claims heard and assessed properly.
Chris Evans, good to talk to you. Thanks for your time this morning.
My pleasure.